Hello there, welcome to episode 72 of Right Where You're Sitting Now, the podcast for the website sittingnow.co.uk. Today I am joined yet again in the co-pilot seat by the ever-decreasingly, what's the word I'm looking for, a man who uses smaller and smaller tense and words to announce his presence.
Monosyllabic? I can't even say it.
Monosyllabic.
Monosyllabic.
Yeah.
Monosyllabic, yeah.
So joining me is Mark with a C, Satyr. How are you doing this week, sir?
Fine.
There we go. There it is. I think it's got to reduce to a grunt soon, surely. I would have thought.
It's like a black hole. It's gonna sort of withdraw into itself and reach sort of, kind of a paint. What's that thing in the centre of the black hole again? Singularity. Yeah. Verbal singularity. This is what I'm aiming for, actually, on this. And then our friends in podcast land will tune in through the starry ether, and there will be just like it'll be silence, but not silence as you've ever known it, and it'll be a whole new sort of era, I reckon, in the whole podcast experiment.
But you can't accuse us of grandeur in this podcast. Anyway, give us a flavour of what we're talking about this week.
Well, it's a book by a gentleman called Morton, and it's called The Child Stealers, Phantom Social Workers and American Mystery. I mean, it's interesting, the subtitle, Phantom Social Workers and American Mystery, because people usually associate that with being a particular United Kingdom sort of phenomena. And and it's a very comprehensive book on that subject. Probably the only book, I should say, that focused particularly on that subject. Although Mr. Cannon has written on the MK Ultra.
Yes, he back in the 90s wrote a book called The Controllers, I believe, which is about mind control and MK Ultra. But this episode we're talking about, yes, like you say, the phantom social workers, and it's something that I personally found interesting. I was going to do an episode, still might do an episode of Sitting Now video for the YouTube channel. Hit like if you're watching this on YouTube, by the way. God, that's so cheesy when people say that. Anyway, so yeah, I was going to do an episode on that because I remember it. I remember it being in the news. My mum worked with children, what she used to, and I remember her being particularly horrified by this spate of random, almost Men in Blackish kind of anonymous phantom is a good word, or bogus as we called it here in the UK, social workers that would turn up and attempt to steal away the children of newborn, new mothers, I suppose, but they would always fail, and it was the whole thing's really bizarre, interesting, and weird. And I thought, that'd make a good episode. And then during my research, I stumbled upon this book, The Child Stealers, and I was like, someone has written a book on it. Fantastic. Got in contact, and so we have Mr. Cannon coming on the show shortly. So anyway, let's pop over to that interview now, and we'll see you on the other side.
All right. Oh gosh, how much of myself do I reveal? It's for many years I was a blogger under the name Joseph Cannon, and I had a blog named Cannon Fire, which was probably most famous for drawing attention to the bulge on George W. Bush's back in the 2004 debates. And that set off kind of a nationwide controversy, or at least for me, it was just a bit of fun. But a lot of people were talking about it for a long time. And my girlfriend Janet was the first person to notice that, so it all started with her. And it led to a major embarrassment for George Bush, but he won the election anyways. Before that, I've written a lot for a number of different publications. I was probably best known for something that I'm quite embarrassed now that I wrote in my 20s called The Controllers. It was all about Project MK Ultra, which has become this very, very hot button topic in more recent years. And I'm afraid that my piece attracted the kind of attention that the kind of people who read pieces like that are not the kind of people I wish to be talking to. No. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. It's funny. We've been talking a lot on the show about kind of how conspiracy used to be kind of a fun subculture, and now it seems to have become this sinister. It's like a dirty word now, way more than it ever was.
Oh, I was involved with it in the 1990s, and it was getting dirty then. And I was, over the course of, I wrote Controllers in 1988, and then a lot of very, very strange people glommed onto me, and they were calling me day and night with their stories. I was actually rather famous in certain circles for a while. And then I don't know, I just became very, very disconcerted by that whole subculture, and it was just kind of a place where I did not want to be. A lot of people using argumentum ad hominem arguments, a lot of people getting very paranoid, a lot of people who seem to have completely lost faith in the very idea of democracy. I didn't want any part of that.
Yeah, and then obviously it got way worse more recently with QAnon and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why I was a little bit afraid to write The Child Stealers, because it is a book about crimes against children, and I was afraid the QAnon crowd might catch on to this book. And although I would be very happy for them to make purchases, and I'll cash the checks, no problem, I really don't want them as fans. What the things that they believe are not the things that I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've looked at the trajectory of their kind of their brand of conspiracy theory, but it does feel like they've just sort of made a kind of mashup of existing conspiracy theories. If you've been kind of following, I used to follow them a lot more when they were, like I say, when they're more fun and more kind of like a subculture rather than like what it's become now. But if you look at QAnon, it's really weird, like how you can see, they've got that from David Icke, they've got that from William Cooper, that's an Alex Jones thing. It's really strange how they've kind of melded all of these conspiracies into this super strange overarching conspiracy. I find that really strange.
Well, those guys are always stealing from each other. I talked to Bill Cooper before he was famous, 1987, I think it was, and even then I could see that he was taking riffs from other, from other fanatics before him.
Yeah, he was I just read a book about him actually. It was quite interesting. I can't remember what it's called. Not Behold a Pale Horse, that was his book, wasn't it? But Pale Horse Rider, that was the name of the book. It's really good. It's an excellent kind of biography of him.
That was because my interest was on MK Ultra at the time. I contacted him early on in my research because he said that he had used hypnosis to recover his memories of this, wonderful document that he supposedly saw during his time in the Navy. Obviously, I don't believe that he saw any such document. The story doesn't hold any water as far as I'm concerned. I will say, though, that when he said that he underwent hypnosis, it was the only time I ever heard Bill Cooper vulnerable. If you've ever heard him speak, he was normally the blowhard to end all blowhards. And this was the only time where he stumbled, and you kind of heard his voice feel a little bit, quivery. Something happened to him, but I don't know what. But I will say that the guy was just an enormous liar and a bully, and he seemed to have prefigured the American Trump phenomenon. The idea that you can make it in this country by relying on paranoia and hatred and just insulting your opponents when you can't make your case logically.
Yeah, it's funny how some conspiracy. It's really weird how there seems to be like a sort of two different types of conspiracy theorists. I'd say there's the kind of what have been termed I think they're called the conspirituality. Is it conspirituality? I think that's the new version of it now, where you have the New Age kind of anti-vaxxy types, and then you have the William Coopers. And I wonder what it is that makes people suddenly switch, because Cooper was all about UFOs, wasn't he? Originally, he saw a UFO, and then all of a sudden he became hard right Christian, kind of anti-Mason, all that, all the sort of tropes of Alex Jones. He sort of basically turned into an Alex Jones, didn't he?
And he didn't do any research. No, I recall one time I confronted him after a lecture, and he was going on about the Illuminati, but he clearly knew nothing about the historical organization. And and I afterwards, in the restaurant connected to this venue, I told him about that, and he said, "Well, you do your research." And I said, just a few months ago, I was doing research in the Library of Congress. I was looking for actual copies of books written by Adam Weishaupt. I know somebody who, if we can work up payment, will actually translate this book, and it will be the first translation of Weishaupt's. I was going on like that, trying to do some scholarly stuff, and he just stands up in the middle of this restaurant and he screams at me, "You do your research!" Huh. I had done the research. He was the one who hadn't. But, what these people call research and what I call research are two different things. Yeah,
I think yours probably includes actually reading a book, whereas I don't think theirs does. We just did a show on the Bavarian Illuminati. A big giant book just came out. It's a translation of an old French book about the Bavarian Illuminati. It's really, really...
Yeah, it sounds very much like the very book you're talking about. So,
yeah.
I suppose the word Illuminati has become like a bit like saying the bogeyman, the boogeyman. Yeah. The boogeyman. If you put the word the boogeyman instead of the Illuminati and all these things, it sort of chimes, doesn't it? It sort of gives a different sort of spin on it.
Well, it's become this completely unhistorical myth, a scarecrow used to frighten people who are extremely gullible. But I also think Illuminati is used as, some of the people who first started to cobble together the Illuminati myth back in the 60s and 70s in the John Birch Society. They were using Illuminati as a way to actually insult the very concept of the Enlightenment. You read those writings back then, and they go after the Enlightenment writers like Diderot and Voltaire as though they were the devils incarnate, as though they were the causes of everything that's problematic today. So I really think that's what they were using the word Illuminati to mean.
Yeah, it's just a kind of convenient group, I suppose, isn't it, for people like that? So let's talk about it. When did phantom social workers first come across your radar?
Well, I had heard of the phenomenon, I guess it was by looking at old issues of 40 and Times magazine. So I knew that it existed, but I always assumed that it was something that had happened in Great Britain because there was a great outcry. There was a wave of these things in the UK, especially in the area of Yorkshire, but also in London and other places in 1990. And actually, that wave I've later found out started in the summer of 1989. And that and the outcry was, the brouhaha was so loud it reached even me on this side of the pond. But I just kept it in the back of my mind. A few years ago, I got it into my mind that I just wanted to write, shall we say, a light work that was going to look at various mysteries involving people, these kind of waves and attacks, like I was thinking in particularly the 2016 Phantom Clown outbreak that occurred here in the United States. That I thought was funny. I thought that was amusing, and I wanted to write about that. And then there were some things that John Keel was writing about, such as, this one is not funny, but phantom casualty notification officers. And these are people who would go around to, during the Vietnam War, would go around to families and tell them that their son had just died in the war and, cause enormous grief and stress. But it turns out that these people were imposters. And the son who was off, in the military actually was perfectly fine. Now, so I did some research into that, and I found out that John Keel was absolutely correct. He mentions this in some of his lectures, which you can find on YouTube. But there are stories in newspaper archives which verify that John Keel knew what he was talking about, that these things did happen. In fact, they went back as far back as World War II. And not only that, they continued, I discovered, including both up to and including both Gulf Wars. Anyways, if ever that book gets published, I can, people will read my chapter about all that. So that was going to be my book about, I was going to call it Phantom Attackers, and it was about various stories like this. And I wanted to have just one story about the phantom social worker phenomenon in England. It was just going to be one chapter. I was going to do it once over lightly. And since I knew that there had been an investigation of the phenomenon called Operation Childcare, and that Operation Childcare in Yorkshire had decided that there was nothing to it, it was all hysteria, and, that it was all, a case of the public going crazy over rumors. And that was going to be my conclusion. And so I actually started to write a chapter along those lines. And then I thought, well, has anything like this ever happened in the United States? So there's no harm in firing up Google and finding out. And that was quite a night, let me tell you, because I found case after case after case after case. A lot of these cases were very recent. And there was no way that anybody could call this stuff mass hysteria. And certainly it was, had nothing to do with what was going on in the UK, because most people here in the United States had never heard of what had happened in Yorkshire back in 1990. So that's when I decided that I had to do some serious research. And, well, very soon a chapter turned into a book. It was a very hard book to write because I don't exactly enjoy writing about crimes against children. But if I didn't compile this database, nobody would. So that's basically how the Child Stealers was written.
And specifically, you settle on this term, phantom social worker. I mean, you make a point that it's not, you don't want to use the word bogus. I mean, just for our friends in podcast land, what exactly, what is the definitive definition? There's an oxymoron of a phantom social worker.
I'm sorry, I should not have gotten ahead of myself.
No, that's perfectly fine.
The term bogus social worker is used a lot in the UK. In fact, the word bogus seems to be used more in the UK than it is in the United States of America. I don't like using that term because, well, some years ago we had the Bill and Ted movies came out, and, the kids in that movie used the word bogus to describe anything they don't like. And so in my mind, bogus is a kid word. It's like teen slang circa 1989, right? And I will always think of the word bogus that way. So I prefer the term phantom social worker, which has also seen quite a lot of use during the UK wave of 1990. And that's why I use that. A phantom social worker is basically an imposter, somebody who goes up to a, usually it's a young single mother, knocks on the door, pretends to be from, here in the United States, we would refer to it as Child Protective Services. It's something else in Great Britain, obviously, and says, I'm here to investigate reports that you've been a poor parent or that you've abused your child. They talk. Sometimes these phantom social workers will show seemingly incontrovertible documentation. They'll show badges. They'll get into the door and they will talk their way into an investigation of the child. They will say, you abused the child, there are bruises on the body, and the parent suddenly becomes very, very defensive and says, no, look for yourself. And an investigation takes place. usually these encounters have become very, very tense, very, very coercive. No matter what the parent says, it's always interpreted in the worst possible light. And you can imagine what's going through the mother's mind during these situations. It's a Kafkaesque nightmare because nothing she can say can make the situation go away. And there are threats to take the child away. And so basically, that's it. One of the oddities of the phantom social worker phenomenon is that the child is never actually stolen. There are no cases where this has happened in the UK. There have actually been a couple of cases where a successful kidnapping came about in the United States. Well, I should say that there are two different types in the United States. There have been two different types of phantom social workers. One of them clearly is a case where you've got women who have psychological issues very, very often. It was right after a miscarriage, and they decide they have to have a child by any means necessary. And these phantoms, these imposters, I should say, on occasion, they have actually stolen children. These are very, very disturbing kidnapping cases. Usually the children are recovered. And very often, because somebody dropped a dime on the kidnapper, a woman suddenly has a child, then she can't really account for it. The neighbors become very suspicious, and they call up, and they might actually know about this kidnapping that has been, appeared in the news lately. This has actually been going on. What I've just now described is something that has been going on for quite some time. The earliest case in my collection goes back to 1919. Should I talk about that case, the earliest case?
Well, let's look at some of the broader stuff first, because there's a few other things I think we should look at before we go into that. But one thing that kind of interested me was you said there's also cases in other countries, so it's not just the US and the UK. I think you mentioned Africa in the book.
It's quite worldwide. As a matter of fact, my preliminary readings have told me that it's a real problem in Africa. Unfortunately, I quickly found out that if I was going to do a proper job on what's happening in Africa and in India, I'd have to know the languages. You can go only so far if you're dealing only with English. And just plus, it's writing about these. I did more than 300 pages on just what was happening in the United States. The African situation it really would warrant a book of its own, and it should be written by an African, by somebody who actually knows those countries.
Yeah, I imagine the culture and the setup there. The social services, whatever the equivalent is the culture. It's probably quite different, isn't it? And it's interesting, Mr. Cannon, in the Shoulder Stealers book. It's in much earlier cases. There's a whole different culture around the whole concept that how we relate to the idea of being adopted and unmarried mothers and so on. That's all part of the kind of background to these kind of events.
Yeah, I should say that. In Africa, it really does appear that they do want to steal the children for the purpose of rehoming the children for a price. That, it really does seem to be a racket. And there was a time when that racket was kind of going on here in the United States. I devoted a chapter to a woman named Georgia Tan, who was the person who made adoption chic. She had befriended many Hollywood stars and so forth. And basically her idea was that poor people did not deserve to have children, that poor people should have their children literally stolen from them and then sold to rich people. And she did this successfully for about 20 years in the beginning in the late 20s and 30s and into the 40s. And, then she died. And when she died, the truth about her situation finally came out, that she had befriended a lot of the powers that be in her home state of Tennessee and, the cops and the political machine that basically ran the state. and that she had arranged for a lot of mothers to lose their children in flagrantly illegal ways. Or women would go in to deliver a child and be told that that there was a miscarriage, that that they had lost a child during delivery, and that was a complete lie. The child would be sold to somebody, to somebody affluent via Georgia Tan. That was a phenomenon related to what I talk about, the child stealers, but it's not really quite the same thing as a phantom social worker, although every so often Georgia Tan's agents did pretend to be, child welfare agents for the state of Tennessee and in other neighboring states as well.
And she had some quite high-profile sort of Hollywood connections, didn't she? She had some quite sort of glamorous, sort of actorly sort of adopters that she was involved. I'm going to say do business with, but I suppose that's what she was doing, wasn't she? Well, she was doing business with them. So, and they came to they tried to come to her defense at some point.
Yeah. I mean, probably the most famous actor that she dealt with was Dick Powell, who adopted through her. And there were some very embarrassing news stories about him when the scandal finally broke. I feel sorry for the guy. I mean, I don't think he knew.
Yeah, she's a real kind of Cruella de Vil kind of character, isn't she? That's what she reminded me of when I was reading the book. So in the book, you also make quite an important kind of definition, which I think we should look at, which is lone nuts versus conspirators. I think it's interesting to look at they're kind of two different types of phantom social workers, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I use the terms lone nuts and conspirators because I used to be interested in the JFK assassination case. Well, I guess I still am, but it's not my primary focus. So I kind of borrowed the terminology from them. The lone nuts were the people I talked about earlier, women who have usually after a miscarriage, they basically just lose their grip on reason, and they decide they had to have a child by any means necessary. This has happened more often than you would think. It seems like it would be a very rare phenomenon, but it does happen. And there are some really horrifying cases. I mean, there are cases even where they've women of this sort have kidnapped pregnant women and killed the mother and then tried to perform a cesarean section. I mean, I don't even like to talk about some of these things.
Yeah, that when I was reading the book, that's exactly what I was thinking, because I was aware that there's a sort of a parallel kind of psychological phenomena of women with a desperate need to have a child and who can't for whatever reasons, who like befriend somebody who's like very close to having a child and pregnant and sort of, and then and they've done it. It's a curious thing. It's happened far more than, like you mentioned, Mr. Cannon, far more than you'd like to think. You'd think, goodness, who would do that? But also, it seems to be there's not been any cases in the UK. Although the only ones I'm aware of, I might be wrong, have been from the United States and
I don't like to think about why that might be the case. But the key word in what you said is befriend. That is one of the main differences between what I call the lone nut case and the conspiracy cases. These women in the lone nut cases, the ones who have had miscarriages and so forth, they ingratiate themselves. They see the mother over a course, over the course of several visits. They befriend the mother. Often we're talking about, single women who are single mothers who are struggling, who are having a very, very hard time of it. And so when somebody shows up with a little bit of money, a few gifts, or even just a kind word, I'm your friend. I'll take care of the kid for you. I know that, you've got to go to work and you can't pay for a babysitter. Things like that. That's the way, I hate to give advice to somebody who's thinking of stealing a child, but if you are stealing a child, that's how you go about it. Now, the ones I call the conspirators, they have a completely different way of going about it. They're coercive. I call them conspirators because they operate in teams. I'm using the word conspiracy as the police use it, as prosecutors use it. Criminal conspiracy is when two or more people conspire to commit a crime. So in any case where you have two or three people pretending to be social workers showing up on your doorstep, that's conspiracy right there. Now, the thing about the conspiracy cases that is particularly troubling is that they're often armed to the teeth with information about the house about the households that they're entering or that they want to enter. They'll know the names. They'll know that a child was recently born to this person or born to this couple. They'll know the social security number sometimes of the mother, the birth date of the child. Things that sometimes they have the medical charts, and that's really, really disturbing that they're able somehow to get this information, and yet the parent checks with the Child Protective Services Agency and discovers that, no, this visitor to my household was a complete fake.
Yeah, it's how. I mean, one thing I found kind of interesting as well in the book was you talk about kind of some of them are kind of repeat offenders as well. They actually, I think in one case I read in the book, they sort of almost canvass an entire area, don't they?
Well, it happens in waves. You see, the first waves involving what I call the conspiracy cases, these phantom social workers working in teams, happened in the early 1980s. Now, that's one of the reasons why I can't, it's ridiculous to say that this was mass hysteria based upon publicities following the UK wave of 1990. Because we're talking about 1982 is when it all starts here in the United States. It started in Florida, and then it moved to Texas. The first big waves in the United States happened in New Jersey. I think it was in 1984, and in Michigan. Michigan, they were all over the state, and it was always the same four people. Now, what's important to understand about both of those waves is that the police did not alert the news media, and the news media were very, very upset about that. This is harmful to public safety if you're not going to warn people about what's happening. But what's good from our point of view is that it kind of made the cases bulletproof, because here we have absolutely no news coverage of these phantom social workers whatsoever, and yet the same descriptions come up in case after case after case. In Michigan, where you had, in 1984, you had four people who looked very, very distinctive. And in New Jersey, where you had a three-person team, and again, very distinctive look. In New Jersey, there was a young, slender, thin-faced, blonde woman with straight blonde hair, calling herself Susan McKay. In many, many different cases, she used the same name. Sometimes she called herself Carol. And her partner was an elegantly dressed black man who had a three-piece suit, and I believe that was the case where he wore a pocket watch even. So it's important to understand that this was the same description in many, many cases, and there could be no possibility. It's just absurd to say there's hysteria involved, because nobody knows what's going on. Members of the public have no idea that this is a thing. Same thing in Michigan, where you have four different individuals.
Interesting. So, I mean, let's talk about some of the more famous American cases. I mean, the three, you sort of identify kind of three particular cases that you say kind of hang the book together, which is Mary Agnes Maroney, Joan Gaycroft, and Linda Taylor. Could we start off by talking about the Mary Agnes Maroney case? Because I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I thought for a while that Mary Agnes Maroney was the earliest case in my collection, and then I'd found out that no, there's some that happened in the 1920s as well. But she was in 1930 in Chicago. This was a case it's hard for me to say whether this is a lone nut case or a conspiracy case, because there's an argument to be made either way. But Catherine Maroney was a very young mother. She married at the age of 13. That was shocking then, and right now I think it would be illegal. But by the age of 17, she was already working on her third kid. Her first kid, Mary Agnes, was 2 years old, and her husband had been laid off. It was the Depression. They were starving. I mean, you can see pictures of the two parents, and it's clear that they know food insecurity. So while the father is away working, he does have it part-time. He does find a part-time job. It's very low-class work, but he'll take whatever he can get because it's 1930, right? And the mother's taking care of the kids, and somebody knocks on the door named Julia Otis, or calling herself Julia Otis. She's an attractive young woman. She claims to work for, gosh, I forget what the agency was called in 1930 Chicago. But she brings groceries, and she says, "Oh, we've heard about your situation, and we're here to help. We think we can get steady work for your husband." And she's saying exactly what Catherine Maroney wants to hear. And it's very clear that this Julia Otis woman instantly falls in love with Mary Agnes Maroney, the 2-year-old daughter, and she just thinks that this is the cutest child she's ever seen. And she actually suggests, "Can I take her to California?" And Catherine is saying, "No, we can't have that." So immediately afterwards, Julia changed the subject and goes back to telling Catherine Maroney everything she wants to hear. We'll bring you food, we'll get work for your husband, and things like that.
I think she also.
Go on.
I was going to say. I think she sort of suggests to the mother that if she goes off and for whatever reasons on this trip with her child, sort of baby will come back as I don't know what the term.
As fat as a butterball. That's what she said.
You know what I was going to say? I thought that's exactly what I thought it was, and I thought, well, no, surely that would sound far too rude if I say that. but yes, I did remember that rightly, and yes, in I'm sure she it's a pleasing image in its own right. But yes, go on.
Right. So on a subsequent visit, this Julia Otis, or this woman claiming to be Julia Otis, comes again, with more gifts. I mean, she's got a layette now for the baby that's going to arrive, and she says, "Oh, little Catherine, I'd love to buy her some new clothing. She needs some new clothing." And by now they're friends, right? And so Catherine Maroney, the mother, says, "Okay, you can take her off and buy her some clothing." And that's it. The child is never seen again. Julia Otis sends Catherine a note saying that she's taken the kid to California. Then we get a note. They get another note allegedly from Julia Otis's employer at the agency, and this employer is very, very apologetic. She says Julia Otis has just lost a child of her own, and that she will return Mary Agnes Maroney very, very soon. But she's very, very apologetic for what Julia has done. Now, it's interesting to note that this second note from the employer is written in a different handwriting. So that's one indication that Julia Otis has an accomplice in all this. And there were eyewitnesses that actually saw her, Mary Agnes Maroney, and an older woman all three together at a train station. And also witnesses saw them at a department store. So I think this is a conspiracy case, although I cannot prove it. But the child was taken.
And the child never reappeared either in this case?
No. It absolutely devastated the Maroney family. I mean, Catherine Maroney was stricken with depression for the rest of her life, and especially on the anniversary of the kidnapping. She would sometimes just wander off and be impossible to find, threaten suicide, things like that. It was just, and really the father was hit just as hard. This was a big case back in 1930. I mean, there was massive attention paid to this, lots of headlines throughout the country. The police checked every train going to California because that was just about the only lead they had. Nothing. Now, for a while, it was thought that they had found Mary Agnes at the age of 20. And that's kind of a complicated story how that came about. But there was a woman named Mary McCollum who had been adopted. She did not know who her parents were. And Life magazine, of all institutions, got this woman together with with the Moroni family. She looked like all of Mary Agnes's siblings. Catherine Moroni and her husband had quite a few children, and they looked alike. I mean, of course, siblings usually look similar to each other, but in this family, they really did all look like they came stamped out by the same factory, right? And this Mary McClellan woman looked like she was a member of the Moroni family, and she was the right age. And Mary McClellan did not know who her parents were, and so everybody, Life magazine is saying, well, that's it. We've solved the case. But no, they didn't solve the case. Many, many years later, I don't know the exact details, but DNA testing proved that this Mary McClellan woman was not a member of the Moroni family.
And I think the woman who came forward much later, was it hypnotism? Did she claim hypnotism? She said something, she's been hypnotized and therefore I can recall all this past.
I don't think that was this case, although I know that it was hypnosis was used in 1930. Hypnosis was used on Catherine Moroni to try to get more details about this Julia Otis woman. It really didn't help. In 1930, hypnosis seemed like this kind of hypno tool that maybe we should use more often. I know something about the history of forensic hypnosis, and I know that starting in the around 1980, it's made illegal in most states. You really can't use hypnosis for forensic investigation.
Yeah. So the next kind of big tentpole case was Joan Gaycroft. Could you talk to us about her?
That was. I believe it was early 1947, an F5 tornado, one of the worst tornadoes in the history of this country, devastated a large swath of Texas and Oklahoma. And hold on a second, I forget the exact town, but Joan Gaycroft's Joan Gaycroft was she was a child living in. Oh, I'm sorry. I really am trying to look this up because I just cannot remember the name.
We're doing the same, don't we? We've got the book here.
Yeah, I just cannot remember the name of the town in which. Anyways, she lives in this fairly small town in Oklahoma that was absolutely flattened. Her mother, Cleta Croft, was killed in basically when the house was destroyed. Her father, Olin Croft, was seriously injured. Joan Gaycroft, who's a 4-year-old child, was herself pretty seriously injured. She got a 10-inch splinter in her leg. Now that's not an insignificant thing for a 4-year-old. Her older sister, was slightly injured in the hurricane. So the husband and the children are sent off to the local hospital, which, as you can guess, is absolutely swamped. This is the worst sort of triage situation. The splinter is removed from Joan Gaycroft. She's bandaged up. The doctor says that she's going to be all right. And the 2 children are kept in this kind of makeshift shelter in the hospital's basement, where a lot of people are huddled together and they're taken care of by nurses. Olin has his own room upstairs because his injuries are really quite serious. A member of the family, makes her way to the hospital, checks on the children, sees that they're all right. I think it was Olin's sister. Checks on Olin, finds out that, he's in serious condition, but they think he's going to be all right. This family member is also a nurse, so she basically goes off to help with nursing duties because it's a terrible situation. Sometime during the night, and this is one of the most bizarre mysteries in all of American history.
Yeah, I found this one fascinating.
Sometime during the night, a team of men wearing uniforms come in. They claim to be agents of the state and that they have come to relocate Joan Gaycroft. Now, they don't want the 7-year-old sister. No, we don't want her. We want Joan Gay, even though she's the one who's been injured. And they take her off. Now, you may be wondering why the hospital, why the nurses would allow this. Apparently, it was because this is 1947. It's right after World War II. And in those days, if you show up wearing any kind of uniform, it's, sir, yes, sir, whatever you say, sir. And that's the way they acted. And it was only afterwards when people started to ask what happened to the little girl. And the police did some checking and found out that nobody from the state had come to collect this girl. They had no reason to. And, why on earth would they want the 4-year-old and not the 7-year-old? Why did they, they mentioned her by name. Why did they ask for this one little girl by name? You'd think was it somebody from the family, who had it against, who had a problem with Olin Croft? Well, they've checked that every way from Sunday, but no, there's nothing along those lines that anybody was able to determine. And to this day, this remains there have been, claimants who have come forward, women who have said, I am Joan Gaycroft. None of them over the years have told a story that has actually held up. And it remains one of the great American mysteries to this day.
This one's particularly interesting to me because this is the first. It almost becomes Fortean, doesn't it? In a way, this kind of stuff where you have people turning up and they seem to have more like above average information on a person, and also seem to be kind of like you say, it's like it seems completely random. Like, why would they know this person's name? And in later cases, we'll talk about they seem to know like in quite intimate details about some of the victims or would be victims.
Yeah, nothing about the case makes sense, and I think this is. Although I try to stay away from Forteana here, this is one case where I can't help but suspect something like that. If somebody was trying to blackmail the parents, the Croft family did have some money, but if somebody was trying to blackmail the parents, why wouldn't they take the 7-year-old? Because it would have been much easier to take care of her. She really wasn't wounded. Joan Gaycroft had a serious wound. I can't explain it.
Do you have any theories or?
No, lots of people have theorized about this one. Members of the Croft family, I know, have theorized endlessly since 1947. Nobody knows anything more about it other than what I have just told you.
What were some of the suggestions? What were some of the theories which sort of grew up around or developed from the experience? Or
there really aren't any theories. Even the false claimants who have come forward saying, I am Joan Gaycroft, even they couldn't come up with a story, to explain. Even if you're using, your imagination and you're trying to come up with some sort of fictional scenario, this is very, very hard to explain away why this would happen.
Yeah, it's a really strange one. Okay, let's go on to Linda Taylor because this one's really interesting as well.
Linda Taylor wasn't her real name, but she was one of the most remarkable criminals in American history. Now, she was not a victim. She was a criminal. I believe that I cannot prove this. I believe that she was the one who committed one of the most remarkable nurse abductions in history. And I should preface this by saying that this is a phenomenon that is allied to the phantom social worker phenomenon. We might call it the phantom nurse phenomenon, babies who are stolen by people claiming to be nurses. Again, this happens more often than you might think, and hospitals even have a term for it. They call it Code Pink. Now, I don't think it happens nowadays because, nowadays it's difficult for just anybody to walk into a hospital. You have to explain who you are and why you're there and who you're visiting. And, I know this from personal experience. But in the old days, in the 60s, people would walk into a hospital to see the newborn babies as a form of entertainment. They didn't have to be family members or anything like that. You could just walk in. And so that's what was happening in 1964 when a woman claiming to be a nurse, said that she had to run some tests on a newborn child named Paul Fronsack. And she spoke at some length with the mother of the child, Dora Fronsack. This nurse took the kid, walked out of the hospital, hailed a taxi, got off at a certain stop, and the kid was never seen again. Well, this again was a huge, huge case, massive, massive headlines. A lot, the mother's description of this of the perpetrator, drawings are in the newspapers, are in the Chicago newspapers, are in newspapers all across the nation. And the photographs of Dora Franzak after her child was stolen are just absolutely devastating. Many years later, well, let me just say that I believe the case is solved. I believe that the Paul Franzak was actually stolen by a woman named Linda Taylor, who was herself a famous criminal in all sorts of other contexts. Should I talk about that now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, Linda Taylor became most famous under that name in the 1970s when Ronald Reagan was first running for president in 1976. He was running against, welfare queens, people who were making false claims of welfare, and there was one who was particularly obnoxious along those lines. She called herself Linda Taylor, and she lived in Chicago, and she had she was getting many, many welfare checks under all sorts of different aliases. This woman was rich enough to own buildings, okay? And she was running all sorts of other scams. And this suited Ronald Reagan's purposes perfectly because he hinted to the audience, without actually directly stating it, that this Linda Taylor person was black. And so that he was kind of playing that card, that they're taking advantage of the system. Well, no, they weren't taking advantage of the system. Linda Taylor was a career criminal. Linda Taylor was a con artist with a long, long history, and welfare fraud was the least of it. She was also, as it turns out, a serial kidnapper. And, I've seen interviews with her son who would say that, we had kids staying with us, they would just suddenly pop into the apartment and then they would suddenly pop out. It is the son who said that Paul Franzak, the stolen child, was one of these children, and that, within his family, he was called temporarily Tiger. And that was his nickname for the few months that he lived with Linda Taylor. And I should also mention that Linda Taylor went by any number of different names. That was not her birth name. She was born Martha Miller. And also, and this was most interesting, that she assumed many different races. She considered herself to be a master of disguise. She was born as Martha Miller to a family, a very poor family in Alabama. They lived in the most racist county in the United States, at probably the worst possible time. And for that sort of, for an interracial marriage, it wasn't a marriage, actually. Her mother had just had an affair with a mixed race man whose identity is questionable. So the child was either one half or one quarter black. We're not quite sure. And at the time, that was considered very, very disturbing. It was literally illegal in that part of Alabama back then. And so the child, they had to pass the child off as white. Now, the child had what we might call Caucasian features and hair, but, had kind of caramel colored skin. So this child, who later became known as Linda Taylor, just made a habit of bleaching her skin in order to fit in. And she took great pride in this. And she would, depending upon the situation, she would appear as a black woman. When she embarked upon her career as a criminal, she would appear as a black woman. She would appear as a white woman. She probably lived most of her life as a white woman, but she also appeared as a Latina and even as an Asian, whatever the situation to describe required, and whatever the mark that she was after required. Because she was a con artist and she used every scam in the book. And it was clear that when she had children coming in and out of her house, that she was kidnapping them for profit. And it's beyond question that she was a kidnapper. There's even an audio interview with a family member that she kidnapped for a brief time.
We'll be right back after this word.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The I think the other sort of links I would say that where things start to get a bit more Fortean, I'd say, actually the later cases, these kind of 80s cases where I don't understand why these phantom social workers kind of keep going almost, because they seem to have a very like high failure rate, don't they, when it comes to and the very strange behavior as well, like very strange in some cases. Like one bit that really struck me was in the book, it says about if the minute they're questioned, they just run. They just vanish. Oh, I left my ID in the car. That's the last I see of them, and they don't come back either, which is the other to the same address. So, could you talk to that a little bit? What do you think is going on there?
I wish I knew what was going on there, but yeah, that is the main mystery, involving the phantom social workers. And it's one of the things that really keeps this separate from what we might call the Q mythology. You talk to a Q person about the phantom social workers, and they'll think that they have the answer. I mean, it's very, very easy to predict what they would say. Oh, well, they are stealing these children, and they want to steal these children because they're going to use them for some abominable satanic sacrifice. Well, yeah, the main problem with that is very simple, is that these phantom social workers, when they work in teams, don't steal children. They try to, they never, ever, ever succeed. And then one of the questions I ask in my book is, and the main question I ask in my book is, why do they keep persisting year after year, case after case, decade after decade, and they never succeed in actually taking a child? They get into the households. They can talk their way into the households. They often talk their way into examining the child, but they never actually, even though they say, well, I still say that this is a case of child abuse. The child has to come with me. That's when the parent gets all defensive and says, you get out of here. And this happens in case after case. As I ask in the book, if you were to open, a donut shop and you never sell a single donut, how long are you going to stay in business? And are a lot of people going to want to get into the donut business because, they've watched your example?
The one case that really fascinated me was the it might have been actually several, but you talk about every now and then they will get one, and then they'll just take them to the park and buy them ice cream or something.
Well, that's it. There have been, I think, a few cases. There was during the 1990 case, and I hesitate to mention this because I could not find the news clip that actually dealt with this specific case. I found one news story that dealt, that referenced it very, very obliquely, and I don't have names, I don't have a date for it, so I don't feel comfortable with it. But supposedly, one of the 1990 cases in the UK. They did manage to, the phantom social workers did manage to make off with a child and took him to a park and bought him ice cream and just left the kid there. This was a toddler. They found the kid, a couple hours later. Now, something like that did happen in 2006. I think this was the Carlos Baez case in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was a very, very strange case. First of all, we're talking about a rather struggling area of Philadelphia. It's not what you'd call an upscale community. 3 alleged social workers come into the Baez household. Carlos Baez is not a young child. He's 11, but they say that this child has been abused, and we've got to take him up. They're not credible social workers. There are 3 young, well, there's 2 young black guys and 1 older fellow who is, he's fairly well dressed, and he's taken the trouble to print up a business card. So he's kind of credible. The 2 younger guys, they're dressed like one's got a baseball cap on and the other's got a hoodie. And I'm like, my God, put some work into it. If you're going to come across as an agent of the state, at least try to dress the part. try to, in the 1980s, they were much better in terms of coming up with fake badges and fake documentation, and they had briefcases and they wore suits and the whole thing. Now they're showing up in hoodies. Anyways, these three guys show up at the Baez household, and they make all these accusations against the parent. The parent gets very angry and orders them out. They show up the next day with guns, and they steal the kid. And they have the kid for all of 1 hour. Now, the news story is available to me, and I got everything that's been printed. The news stories available to me are very, very oblique about what happened. Apparently, there's nothing involving sexual molestation or anything like that. They just drove around for a while. They talked on a payphone. They drove by, but apparently did not enter a hotel. And then they dropped him off in a park about 7 miles away from home. So it's not really a kidnapping, is it?
No.
Except in the most technical sense of the term.
Yeah, it's very strange, isn't it? I mean, yeah, it's that's where the real kind of that's where it starts to feel more John Keel-esque to me. These kind of stories where this is kind of what piqued my interest. Actually, I read the story about the kid that was just left in the park, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So that's how I followed it up and eventually found your book, actually. But yeah, it is interesting actually. And Keel himself actually talks about a similar incident, doesn't he, to a phantom social worker, which is the kind of phantom portrait photographers. I thought that was really interesting.
Well, yeah. In his lectures, he mentions that at the same time when he was investigating all the Mothman weirdness in West Virginia, there was also this phenomenon of people going around wanting to take photographs of people's babies. And these are people, they're not very well to do. And somehow these phantom portrait photographers knew that there was a child in the household, and they were actually quite happy to have have somebody come in there and take pictures of the kids. But the parents never got the photographs, and whatever agency they claimed to be working for turned out to be completely non-existent. John Keel said that he came that close to actually running into one of these, but as Get Smart used to say, much. I guess, friends. I found another few phantom photographer incidents, and some of them were very, very disturbing. Children were actually stolen, and I think in one case, one of the parents was killed by somebody claiming to be, a child portrait photographer who just, who just wanted to take a photo of the kid, and no charge. There was some sort of spiel along those lines. So yeah, that happens.
Yeah, I mean, also as well, sort of riffing on the John Keel angle and things. I mean, he's usually associated with, like you mentioned, the Mothman, identify flying objects, and all that. And he calls them ultra-terrestrials, doesn't he, rather than extraterrestrials? But again, you got although it doesn't originate with him, you've got the Man in Black. The Men in Black figures, and they're, sort of authority figures, aren't they, from some kind of mysterious agency working on behalf of the government or the authorities, and that's a very similar sort of role, isn't it? It's a very similar narrative.
Well, some people have compared the phantom social worker phenomenon to the Men in Black accounts. I'm a little. I'm a little hesitant to get into that because, first of all, in America, the phantom social workers, they don't wear black generally. One of the things they do, however, is wear disguises. What I mean is subtle disguises, something that it would make it a little bit difficult to identify them, in normal circumstances. In quite a few cases, I ran into women with jet black hair, unnatural black hair. Obviously, that's hair dye or a wig. And so when I say disguises, I mean things like that. You can see, or blondes who clearly were not born blonde, eyeglasses that are very large and very distinct. So when I say disguises, I mean things like that, that would figure into an eyewitness description that would not necessarily describe the person in a non-PSW situation.
Yeah, and you wouldn't catch the men in black wearing baseball caps, would you? I mean, let's face it.
No. That's one of the things. I'm sorry, I go on about that in the book, but it really does bother me. If there's one thing that's worse than a criminal who preys on children, it's a criminal who doesn't put any work into it.
It makes it seem more mysterious. Yeah, what could be their motivation, or what was the reasoning, or what was the thinking process? Yeah, what were you thinking?
Well, I have cases, in the 1980s, again, they dressed for the occasion because these state agencies, they have dress codes. That's one of the things you should look for is whether they're dressed properly. And yet, for the phantom social workers who have been showing up in, I'd say the past 15 years, I have cases where they're wearing like khaki shorts and a t-shirt, sandals, tennis shoes. I mean, come on, guys, put some work into it, put some effort. Think of it like the movie Ocean's 11. You've got to practice. You have to dress for the part.
Yeah. Why do you think the American press and police were kind of? I mean, I don't want to put it too. Well, I suppose it is that. Why were they so tardy in kind of linking these cases, especially the later ones? It seems like with the internet and all sorts of things, they just don't seem to be linking these cases at all. In your book, you say that they're just they're these kind of like islands almost, aren't they? Each case is it almost feels like they're not kind of cross-referencing at all.
That's one of the things that really, really bothers me. I mean, somebody should have written a book like this one a long time ago, and I wish I could distribute what I've written to gratis to every police department and every small newspaper in this country, because I was just going over. There was a case in Indiana, or it was a wave in Indiana, phantom social workers, in 1992. The head of child services, was interviewed by a journalist at that time, and he said, "I'd never heard of anything like this happening before." That's almost a direct quote. Well, there had been a previous wave in Indiana, in that exact same county, in 1989. What do you mean you never heard of anything like this happen before? Haven't you ever talked to anybody in your own department? Similarly, when the Willie Wilson scandal happened in early 2000s, there was a claim that the child was probably murdered by her foster caregiver, but the foster caregiver originally claimed that the child was stolen by a phantom social worker, basically. And the Department of Child Services in Florida sent out a statement saying, "This has never happened before. We've never heard of such a thing happening before." What do you mean you've never heard of such a thing happening before? Florida is one of the states that the phantom social workers like best. The first of the what I call the team effort cases in December of 1982. No, I think it was earlier in 1982, but it happened in a suburb of Miami. That was. There was also a case early on in Clearwater, Florida. But Florida is a case that they hit all the time. How come they don't know the history of this whole phenomenon?
Well, maybe in Florida it's because so much weird stuff goes on in Florida. There's like an overflow.
One of the most famous recent cases is the Jesse McCombs case in Marysville, Washington. That happened in 2019. For some reason, that one got massive amounts of publicity. And again, the newspapers are talking like, "Oh, gosh, what happened to this poor woman? It's never happened before." What do you mean it's never happened before? Not only are they completely unaware of what had been a major phenomenon, a nationwide discussion in the UK throughout the years 1990 and 1991, but it also has happened many, many times in Michigan, in Indiana, in Nebraska, usually in what we call the flyover states. Not so much California and New York, but all these states in between. Many, many, many cases.
Yeah, one thing I'd never heard of before, and I think it was more of a kind of more of a point of interest in the book, but this kind of thing in Cleveland, the R.A.D test, it's kind of gross but interesting.
Well, it's not something I want to talk about in any detail, but we're talking now about Cleveland, the county in Yorkshire. So this is the UK, and it's not Cleveland, Ohio. See, okay, I'll get into that a little bit later, why that distinction is important. But when the great UK wave of 1990 hit, and everybody was talking about phantom social workers or bogus social workers at that time throughout the British Isles, when that hit, everybody said, oh, this is just mass hysteria arising from the Cleveland scandal. Now, the Cleveland scandal is something that happened in 1987. And it was a very disturbing set of events. It wasn't really a phantom social worker event, but it has to be mentioned in context of the UK wave of 1990. What happened in Cleveland was that there was a pediatric doctor named Marietta Higgs, who joined the staff at the beginning of 1987 of I forget what it is, the main hospital in that county in England. And she had become recently converted to a test called reflex anal dilatation. And this was a test to determine whether a child has been sexually interfered with. And I think I'm just going to leave it to the imagination as to how this test was conducted. But this Marietta Higgs, Dr. Higgs, performed this test routinely on just about every child that came under her care. And she decided that all of these kids who got a positive on the R.A.D test must have been sexually abused. And we're talking about some very young kids. But this is not something I enjoy talking about. It turned into a major scandal because eventually within this fairly constricted population, she identified 125 abuse victims. Now, this was far, far more than the system was set up to take. In other words, the first 12 or 15, they were able to find foster parents for these kids. After that, they had to warehouse the kids at a hospital, and the hospital was not set up for this. And the hospital was saying, we don't have the money for this. We're not a child care agency. And Dr. Higgs, her attitude seemed to be, that was really the problem, is that she was actually kind of arrogant. Money, that's not my department. All I know is I have to take care of these children. And that turned into a major scandal. People started saying, this R.A.D technique of determining whether a child has been abused, it's brand new. Are you sure that we can trust it? It's very, very invasive. I mean, doesn't this count as a kind of child abuse perpetrated in the name of catching a child abuser? This is all very, very iffy. And what are the chances that all of a sudden in this 1 year, we would have 125 child abuse cases, whereas normally we might have about 10? So it turned into a major, major scandal, and all of Yorkshire, and really the entire country, was talking about it. Eventually, the police stopped cooperating with Dr. Higgs. They refused to take the children away from their parents. The parents were getting on television and, claiming that they were the victims of a witch hunt. The country basically turned against Dr. Higgs. Many of the children were returned to their parents, and a lot of people automatically presumed, well, that's it. It was just a witch hunt. This was a case of mass hysteria. And then in 1990, when the phantom social workers struck the UK, everybody just said, It's the same hysteria. People started talking about child abuse, in the wake of the Cleveland scandal, a few years earlier, and now it's the same thing. It's happening again.
And what's really fascinating is that kind of explains why, you talk about these kind of debunkers on Reddit, which we'll come to in a second because I think they're quite annoying. But this does you can see why the people make a link to the Satanic Panic as well, can't you? Of that period as well. It has a similar sort of, almost like a similar setup, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and that was it. I mean, in the UK, when it happened in 1990, they were able to point to the Cleveland scandal of 3 years earlier, and they were able to say, well, that set off a panic, and it's still with us. Similarly, in the modern era, we could point to what's going on now and say, well, that this is just the Satanic Panic. Well, I have some problems with that. First of all, the cases in the 1980s, that was not a panic of any kind. They were all geographically isolated. In other words, the people who were dealing with the situation during the major wave in Missouri, and that was a big, huge, problematical, complicated wave. They weren't talking about what was happening in New Jersey, in Calgary, in Nebraska, in Iowa, in Texas. Nobody put the big picture together until I did. Nobody knew that this was happening in all of these states at pretty much the exact same time. So you can't say that there's a panic because there was no communication and there was no news coverage. I'm sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say that I think the link is more the kind of mass hysteria kind of angle, so rather than it being mechanically the same, it's more like the excuse is the same almost.
Yeah, well, you can't point to mass hysteria because, also, as I said, the cases received no news coverage, even in the flap areas of Michigan, New Jersey, and Missouri. For months, these things were going on with not a single news story. So how can you say that there's mass hysteria? I mean, there was no internet then. People weren't talking about it.
I was thinking more of the British cases, because in the UK it was just the police put it down to mass hysteria, didn't they? And
yeah,
and then there was a kind of minor mass hysteria, I suppose, in Yorkshire at least. But let's talk about Reddit, because there's this Reddit
May I say before I go on,
yeah.
One of the explanations that was offered by Operation Childcare, which was the official police investigation of what happened in Yorkshire, was that people were mistaking Mormons, going door to door for these phantom social workers.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
It's like, oh, come off of it. First of all, the phantom social workers, one of the things that's most disturbing about them is that most of them are female. In those days, Mormons going door to door were all male. And second of all, Mormons go all over the world and everybody knows who they are and what they are about. They announce themselves. They try to get you to read the Book of Mormon, not asking to look at your kid. So that explanation is absolutely ridiculous. And I don't know why they expected anybody to believe that nonsense.
It'd be interesting to interview one of the police involved with the case, wouldn't it? Just to find out what their kind of mindset was in that. Because I read that. I remember it made me laugh out loud actually when I read that in the book. It was, you can't. I mean, yeah, it's just preposterous, isn't it? How can you, how can you confuse a child snatcher with a Mormon?
Oh, it's absolutely. Oh, one last word about the Satanic Panic thing. I've gone through every news story I could find from all sorts of, fairly small local newspapers to larger newspapers, throughout the 1980s. And I know that supposedly was the decade of the Great Satanic Panic. Nobody is bringing up the occult. Everybody is treating these cases very straightforwardly. And if anybody wants to do follow-up research and look at these news stories for themselves, I still have all the clippings. And if you're serious about that, I'll send them to you. If you can find anything in there that has anything to do with the occult or anything that hints at the so-called satanic panic, well, I will be very surprised. The news coverage, as far as I could see, was very, very straightforward. It was not overbearing. It was not sensationalistic. It was not hysterical. They were trying to warn the public, but that's what they darn well ought to have done, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, one thing, I mean, with kind of internet sleuthing that goes on these days, sometimes it's very successful, but I often find that sometimes you get these kind of like hyper skeptical. I think you even said the same thing in the book, actually, that you get these kind of people that are sort of hyper skeptical to a point where it becomes almost a religion, skepticism itself. And it feels like, because I went and had a look at the Reddit post about phantom social workers, and it feels very like they feel like they've concluded the matter. But I think you do a really good job of kind of dissecting and kind of sort of stomping on it actually in the book quite well. Could you talk a little bit about that Reddit? Because people are bound to, like, people listen to this show, they might Google it, and that might be one of the first things they kind of come across. And it does feel like it's fairly it was not a good job on the front of Reddit.
Well, first of all, Reddit says that they've done this. I know the Reddit article to which you're making reference. They say that they've done a full review of all the phantom social worker cases. No, they haven't. They're doing a very cursory review of some of the cases that occurred in the UK in 1990. They don't even know that the 1980s cases in the United States happened. They don't even know that there's a history of this thing that goes back to more than 100 years at this point. And they don't bring in all of the more recent cases, some of which are quite confounding. And we're talking about the last few years. The Reddit pieces and really all of the skeptical writing on the phantom wave of 1990 in the UK all goes back to a story that was published in The Independent on August the 16th, 1995, and the writer was a woman named Glenda Cooper. I don't mean to offend this Cooper woman, but it's very bad. It's a very bad case because it's contradictory. It poo-poos all of the cases. It says that Operation Child Care has completely solved everything, and they said that the Independent case starts out by saying that there was not one case that was confirmed. And then a few paragraphs later, it says, okay, there were only 2 real cases out of 250. And then a little bit later, it quotes an Operation Child Care investigator as saying, well, we found that there were 2 teams involved. 2 teams? Well, that seems to indicate that there were more than 2 real cases. But I compared this to a story that appeared in The Guardian when Operation Child Care shut down in 1991, or was concluded. And that story said that there were 50 real cases. And again, that was kind of a conservative estimate. 50 is a lot. 50 phantom social workers getting into households and examining children. That's a lot. So I don't even know. And then Glenda Cooper spends the second half of her article looking into another case, a case that happened in 1994, involving a fake healthcare worker who visited a woman named Ann Weil and tried to get access to her son. This phantom social worker had with her the kid's medical file printed out. The kid had asthma, and the phantom social worker knew all this and was asking questions about this, and actually had the documentation, on her little notepad, and brought it into the household with her. This is a good case. How can Glenda Cooper say that it's all fake when half her article is devoted to one really good case? And how could all of these knee-jerk skeptics on Reddit poo-poo the entire phenomenon when A, they don't know anything about the scope of this phenomenon, and they're basing it on this one article in The Independent, published in 1995. They're not basing it on an actual report. And I can say that concretely because no such report has ever been made public. Operation Child Care never issued a report. And frankly, I'm a little worried about our cousins across the pond. How could you be happy with a scandal that gets resolved that way? Why didn't you hold out for a report? Why? You have this one rather biased news story appearing in one newspaper, and you say, okay, that's it, case closed, it's solved. Why don't you ask the Yorkshire Police, may we please see your evidence?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. That is bizarre for this country as well. We're a stickler for a report usually. Yeah, that in itself, there's so many, and this is what kind of makes this thing so interesting to me. I think is that there's so many bizarre little moments like this throughout the story, isn't there? There's these kind of bizarre behaviours of the phantom social workers. There's the lackluster, almost like lethargic investigations. It's really quite bizarre. One question I was going to ask was, did QAnon ever? You sort of mentioned them earlier on, but did they ever actually mention phantom social workers? Is it ever a kind of, has it come up, as it were, within that group that you know of?
Yeah, I guess my answer to that would be not yet, but I'm dreading the day. The way those people think, again, it's not the way I think. I don't want them to glom onto this because, of course, they'll try to make it out to be that these children are being, stolen for some sort of satanic sacrifice. No. We've had literally, I've documented hundreds of attempts of cases where the phantom social workers get into a household, interact with the parent, often examine the kid, photograph the kid. That's going on, but they don't actually kidnap the kid. If these are kidnappers, they're the worst kidnappers in history, but they're also the most persistent kidnappers in history. We have only a couple of cases, I've already discussed them, where the phantom social workers did make off with a kid and kept the kid for only an hour. Only an hour. And nothing bad seems to have happened to the child during that time.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. Let's talk about kind of some of your theories, because you do have some towards the end of the book. And do you believe it's just things like paedophile rings or child pornography rings, I should say?
Well, I should say that I changed my mind. I changed my theories as I was writing the book, and I make that very clear. Originally, I thought that these were people who were trying to steal children in order to sell children for black market adoption, because there really was quite a market for that, starting especially in the 1970s. The market for adopted children really started to shut down because what we call maternity homes started to shut down across the country because unwed mothers were just keeping their kids. The culture changed, and our attitudes toward sex changed. It was no longer considered to be incredibly shameful to be an unwed mother in the year 1970, and certainly by the year 1980, everything had changed. And so there were far fewer kids available for adoption, and there were quite a few couples who wanted them. And so, yeah, there was big money for children. And there were cases in the 1970s where it was pretty obvious that they were trying to get, and in some cases did get, the child for the adoption market. But no, that's not what's going on with the, what I call the team efforts, starting from 1982 onwards. This is something different because they never really succeeded in getting the child, and yet they keep on going and they keep on going at it. So I was in the market for a different explanatory scenario. And I think I found it when I looked into the Richard Burris case of 1994. I don't think we've talked about that, but Richard Burris was a man who, where I used to live in the San Fernando Valley, he would go scouting around there for young children in the northeast sector of the San Fernando Valley. That's basically where a lot of Hispanic people live, and to be honest, no small number of them are not quite legal. They're in the country illegally, and even the ones that are here illegally are usually very, very deferential to authority. So he would go, find a place where there were kids and go inside and say, claiming to be a child welfare agent. He would show ridiculously spurious badges and identification, and he would, accuse the parents of beating the children, and able to talk his way into a physical examination of these young boys and girls, some of them very young. And it's a very disturbing case. Richard Burris was a man with a known history, had been accused of pedophilia before. He was also a man who was very, very computer savvy for 1994. I mean, he was an early adopter of the internet. He used Photoshop, and often it is the outsiders in our society who are the early adopters of this sort of technology. And basically what he was doing was he was taking photographs of these children and manipulating them so that he could sell these photographs on the internet black market. And I thought, and this was a major case. It received a lot of coverage in the Los Angeles area, and it actually led to the passage of a law, the Child Pornography Prevention Act of 1995-96, which was sponsored by Orrin Hatch and a fellow named Joe Biden. So this was an important case, and it told me, well, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the reason why these people are doing what they're doing. Very shortly after the Richard Burris case, there was a case in, I believe it was in Pennsylvania, where a woman is upstairs with her children, is upstairs cleaning, and she sees flashes of light coming from downstairs. These are photographic flashes. What had happened was that she had several children, one of her older children had let in two people claiming to be social workers from Child Protective Services or whatever they were calling it in Philadelphia, or in Pennsylvania, I should say. And she had let these people in, and these people were taking pictures of the baby, allegedly to look for bruises on the body of this baby. Now, if they had wanted to steal the baby, they could have. They had every opportunity. It would have been easy. But instead, they wanted to photograph the baby. So that's, and the mother, of course, shooed them out of the house and then called the cops. There were two of them, a man and a woman. So again, that led me to believe, or led me to speculate, I should say, maybe that's been one of the main purposes of the phantom social workers all along. Maybe they're there to take photographs. And then I got to thinking about some of these cases from the 1980s where, especially you had these very well-dressed gentlemen with the three-piece suits and a pocket watch. In the 1980s, who wears a pocket watch? But you do some research into the history of miniaturized cameras, you find out that the first time somebody put a camera into a pocket watch was 1897. That technology goes back a long, long ways, and those cameras are far more prevalent than anybody thinks. And so that's basically my theory, or what I was thinking, that by 1980s, a lot of these very small miniature cameras that we associate with spy work, they were actually all made by, Minox is not the CIA. It's a company. And they made these things for the consumer market, even though they're very tiny little cameras and you can use them clandestinely. And they were being sold on secondhand, pretty decent prices, at photographic shops and, in the classified sections of magazines. People were using them as toys or as gimmicks or as just novelty items, but they worked. And it was very, very possible. Now consider the situation. You've got a single mother very, very worried that her child is going to be taken away from her. And the phantom social worker has talked this mother into allowing you to examine the child. And the mother is watching during this examination because she knows that if even the slightest bruise appears on that child's body, then she's going to be in trouble, that she's going to be accused of this or that, because the pattern of the banter of the phantom social worker has been very coercive and very accusatory. Again, it's a situation where nothing the parent says is right. Everything is always taken the worst possible way. And so during the examination, mom's eyes are going to be on the child, and she's not even going to notice if, one of the, because the Phantom social workers are showing up in 2 or 3 man teams, if one of the others are actually clandestinely photographing the kid.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I still feel that there's this strangeness to it, though. Like there's a I can't put my finger on it. I think that you're probably right in most cases, but some of them just feel too weird. Do you know what I mean? Like the ones where the fact that they just vanish so easily when challenged, and it's just something off about it. I think that was kind of my takeaway from the whole thing is you're probably right in most cases, but there's a few where I just thought, I don't know, there's just something a bit off.
You and I are in agreement there. As I was saying recently to somebody who had read my book and challenged my theory, and I said, please challenge it, because I'm not convinced of my own theory. I will just go so far as to say, right now, I think it's the least bad of the theories that have been, that are available to me. There are so many details of these cases that just don't make any sense when looked at from any. One of the details is that the Phantom social workers conduct house searches. I don't think I talked about this in the book, and I should have. But for example, I'm right now I'm looking at a case from 1997. It's an English case. Well, it's in Lancashire. And this woman calling herself Kay Taylor shows up at the home of Maria Lynn, who's, again, a young mother with a single mother. And she uses a child abuse complaint as her pretext. She gets into the home. And what she does is she doesn't just search the child. She searches the entire house, opens all the cupboards, all the drawers, looks through the refrigerator, that whole thing. That happens more often than you might think. That happened actually not too far away from where I'm sitting right now. There was another 1990s case here in Baltimore, just across the Key Bridge. A woman comes into, again, in this case, it's the father who's raising the kid. She's making all sorts of accusations. People have seen you beating your children in the middle of the apartment complex. I have to examine the child for, bruises. And of course, the father is like, oh my God, yes, please look at my child. You'll see that there's nothing wrong. He invites her in. She conducts the investigation of his young child. But then, strangely, she searches his entire apartment for God knows what. Every single drawer, every single closet, the refrigerator, all the cabinets in the kitchen. Now, you could say, well, maybe she's a pedophile and that's why she examined the kid. Well, that's kind of a problematic theory. But if that's the case, why did she go through all the cabinets and drawers in the apartment? And you could say, well, maybe she's a burglar and she was scouting out the apartment for some reason. Okay, but then why did she look at the kid? It doesn't make sense no matter how you look at it.
Yeah, it's really it's something kind of eerie about it. I can't quite put my finger on it. Anyway, but thanks so much for giving us some of your time. I really appreciate it. Are you working on anything new? Do you have any new things coming up?
Oh gosh. Well, I always have about a dozen books in various stages of being written, and The Child Stealers is the only one that I actually saw to the finish line, because I just thought the situation, the topic was very important, and I wanted to get a database out there. And next time there's a young single mother who has to go through this, I want somebody to say to her, look, you're not the first person this has happened to. You may be treated like you're the first person this has happened to, but there's a long, long history here. And, so here's a database. And if there is a mother who's in that situation, I'll give you a copy of my book for free, because I just want this information out there. As for what I'm writing right now, actually, I was writing something about with my partner about Leonardo da Vinci, and about the geometry that is embedded into a couple of his paintings, particularly The Last Supper and the Salvator Mundi. And I know that there has been just an awful lot of crap on that topic, about hidden geometry in paintings and sacred geometry and all that nonsense. I think that what I have is something that I can prove. And maybe I should just leave it there until this book actually comes out, if it comes out.
And if people want to kind of, you said you blog occasionally. If people want to find your blog stuff online, where would they look?
I haven't written a blog post in months, and it's because I find the situation so depressing. I mean, my party, the Democrats, they're doing everything wrong right now. And yet, oh my God, what's happening on the other side is just abominable. And so at this point in my life, I'm telling absolutely everybody, I don't want to talk about politics. I'll talk about anything else, but not politics.
And actually, we should say we're recording this on the day where our Prime Minister's just resigned. So yeah, we've got just as bleak a situation over here, I think. So yeah, I find it all a bit miserable as well.
Yeah. I'm really, really sorry, guys. I know that it's a difficult situation over there. So again, you could probably understand why, if you're like me, you'd probably rather talk about Leonardo da Vinci.
Oh yeah.
Or anything.
Yeah, way more interesting. Anyway, yeah. But thanks a lot anyway. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cannon. That was very comprehensive and clear. Very clear walk through the subject.
Well, again, thank you very much. And, I just appreciate the chance to publicize this topic.
And we are back. That was a really, I always say this every week, that was a great interview, but we just keep getting lucky, I think, with interviews.
It was very clear, very comprehensive. And like as Mr. Cannon says, it's a troubling subject matter. It's interesting to sort of reflect as well that, when the notion, I suppose often people have this anxiety of like, the social workers or the authorities coming to take their children away from them and so on, but in the lived reality is that rarely happens, and it's only at the very last resort. It's far more for all sorts of reasons. That's always the last resort, and in vast majority of cases social workers, if they're involved with families, are known to the family for a long time, and vice versa, and often supportive in all sorts of different ways. So it's not the image. It's interesting. The phantom social worker image or narrative is like some kind of authority sort of randomly coming off and running off your children, but the lived reality of these things is more nuanced, and actually and intending, and the intention is one of a supportive role.
I think it's interesting just from a kind of 14 perspective as well. It's interesting. It's it kind of plays into the same fears, like I said in the interview, the same fears as the kind of Men in Black kind of, these it's just the weird behavior. That's the thing it's the same thing that makes the Men in Black cases so interesting, is that the behavior of the kind of, in the book, like I mentioned in the interview, they act in a very strange way when challenged, for example, in a very weird way. Well, they'll just vanish. That's it. Any challenge, they're gone. And it's like, that's very strange. I don't know. There's just something odd, eerie, and a bit Fortean to the story, as well as. But in the interview, we also talk about his conclusion, this idea that it's for child pornography, which I also agree is a pretty, sensible.
Yeah. I mean, whatever. I mean, I don't think there's I don't think there's a mystery in the true Fortean sense, but there's a mystery. There's a sociological, cultural, psychological mystery.
Yeah.
And something, like you say, there's in some of the cases, not all of them, some of them there's something certainly very off kilter.
Yeah. Definitely. And it's quite nice. I mean, from a sitting now point of view, it's kind of nice to, we don't always want to be covering the occult and occult subjects. So it's nice to every now and then to sort of, go off track a little bit and, look at something a bit more Fortean or a bit more mysterious. like this as well. So
It's all part of the landscape.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all part of the hinterland. Well, it's not even the hinterland. It's all part of the, the flora and fauna of the hinterland, which is sitting now, which stands on the borders of some parallel reality.
Exactly. Anyway, if you want to find us online, we're on all socials. Just type in @sitting_now, or no, you wouldn't put the @ in, but you know what I mean. Just type in sitting now, one word. Find us on YouTube. Give us a like. Give us a subscribe. We're really close to 1,000 now. Subscribers, that is. And yeah, we'd appreciate you coming over and giving us a like and a subscribe. Anyway, we will see you next week, and I think we are returning to the world of the occult. Yeah, we are. So we will see you next week.